Good morning, everyone. My name is Gerard Robinson. I'm a resident fellow in the Education Policy Studies program here at AEI. And for those of you who are here for the first time, I want to welcome you to AEI. For those of you who have been here before, welcome back. Same to those who are watching us through live stream. We're here today to talk about criminal justice reform and recidivism. Given the fact that we have 2.2 million people who are incarcerated in state and federal prisons, and we know that 95% of them at some point will return to their communities, roughly 640,000 a year, we've got to figure out what we can do. And from a federal level, it would be great to know what we're doing from a policy and programmatic level. I could think of few people in Congress to have this conversation than to have it and to ultimately invite Senator Grassley. He is the chairman of the Senate Committee for the Judiciary. He's also a committee member for Senate committees for Finance and Budget, and also the Joint Tax Committee. He's also the chair of the Senate Committee for the International Narcotics Control. Prior to coming to Washington, D.C., he was a member of the Iowa legislature, where he actually worked as a legislature, but also worked 10 years as an assembly line worker. He moved to Washington, D.C., became a member of Congress, and in 1980 he was elected to the Senate, and so he's seen this issue in many ways. What I'm going to do is invite Senator Grassley to the podium. He will speak for approximately 10 minutes. Afterward, he'll join me on stage. We'll have a moderated discussion for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. And so with that, I have the honor to introduce Senator Grassley.
Thank you all very much. It's a privilege for me to be with you, and I suppose if I looked everybody in the face, there might be a few people here I know, but on the other hand, you all look so darn young, maybe not, unless you're a Hill staffer or something like that. Just so I don't forget it, when I start talking about our efforts towards sentencing reform, I want everybody to know that I've worked very closely with Democrat Whip Senator Durbin of Illinois on this subject. I may not mention him a whole lot, but he needs to have a great deal of credit to get us where we are today. So thank you for inviting me to be with you. I know the American Enterprise Institute a little bit because they put out a lot of papers that congressmen and senators pay attention to, widely respected, and particularly among conservatives. It's no surprise that the American Enterprise Institute, as a conservative organization, would be highlighting the important issues of sentencing reform, both from the standpoint of freedom, as well as what it has to do with the economy of the taxpayers' money. To set the stage for this bill, the legislation that I'm involved with, let me start with a little bit of history. The Sentencing Reform Act of 1984 was a bipartisan product. It eliminated federal parole, promoted sentencing uniformity, and helped to ensure violent offenders can't continue victimizing people in our communities. Crime rates fell. Congress also created additional mandatory minimum sentences, which continue to be critical in keeping the worst of the worst off the streets. Mandatory minimums can also be helpful in encouraging cooperation with law enforcement efforts to take down kingpins. For these reasons, I continue to support mandatory minimums. After the Supreme Court wrongly changed the sentencing guidelines from mandatory to voluntary, mandatory minimum sentences are now the only tool available to make sure that judges do not abuse their discretion and impose sentences that are too lenient or unfairly inconsistent. The reality today is we all recognize the many concerns that have been raised regarding our current sentencing structure, particularly for nonviolent drug offenders. long prison sentences always come with a cost to the taxpayers, a cost to families, and to our communities. In many ways, and in many cases, the severity of the crime justifies these costs. But as we're all aware, that isn't always the case, hence the movement for sentencing reform. While the vast majority of incarcerated U.S. drug offenders are in state prisons, a bipartisan group of senators and I set out to re-examine drug sentences at the federal level. What resulted was a truly bipartisan effort to tackle a serious policy challenges and also recognize that some of the changes made in the 1980 legislation went too far or had consequences beyond what anybody expected at that particular time. Senators during these negotiations brought a variety of perspectives and proposals to the negotiating table and shared the same goal of promoting fairness in the sentencing regime. In many months of negotiating, we reached an agreement on a compromise bill. And while no one would have drafted the bill precisely the way that it came out, the bill gained more bipartisan support and greater support from outside groups. The bill expanded the safety valve for people who had not been convicted of violent felonies. It cut the mandatory minimum sentences for other drug crimes after taking circumstances into account. It applied retroactively the earlier reduction in the sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine that we had passed several years ago, and it made various other reforms to sentencing, including allowing sentences to be expunged in certain circumstances involving young, first-time, nonviolent offenders. It also created an alternative to the unconstitutional federal sentencing law that permits juveniles to receive life sentences without parole. Finally, the bill established back-end sentencing reform in what is called the Corrections Act. The Corrections Act would enable some prisoners to serve less time if they successfully completed programs that have proven to reduce the likelihood that they would recommit additional crimes upon release. The goal is not only to save money by housing fewer inmates, but to reduce costs to society by reducing the chances that people released from prison will reoffend. The bill passed 15-5 through our committee. All 5 no votes were Republicans, I'm sorry to say, since you know I'm a Republican. Had the bill reached the floor, it could have passed overwhelmingly, I'm satisfied. However, the Republican caucus, so I want to nail the consequences where they ought to be, was divided, and consequently the leader would not schedule the bill for floor action. The House Judiciary Committee actually moved very fast on a series of bills, but House Republicans were also divided, and no sentencing bill reached the House floor last year. Now, we continued, after the bill got out of committee, we continued to negotiate following our committee's vote, working with any senators and outside groups that have expressed flexibility in supporting the bill if we made certain changes. We made changes to the bill, original provisions concerning the misnamed Armed Career Criminal Act. We also made adjustments to the use of funds saved by the bill and created a national commission to review the criminal code. This brought additional Republican co-sponsors and the support of a number of law enforcement groups that previously did not support the bill. The changes we incorporated have kept the package balanced and unified, and it must remain that way if it's to advance during this Congress. That means keeping it intact. The sentencing bill does not change any element of substantive criminal law. But various members of both houses have insisted that any sentencing bill change substantive criminal law regarding intent. They want to do away with any federal crime that does not require criminal intent. There are many such laws, and no one can say how many or exactly which laws would be affected by such a change. In this Congress, the Bipartisan Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act has not yet been introduced. We're looking forward to input from the administration. We had the support of the Obama administration. I think we have a chance of getting the support of this administration. Now, you know, you look at some people appointed by this president, you might believe otherwise, but I have reason to believe it's possible. I know that there is both support and opposition within this White House. I certainly believe that it is consistent to be tough on crime and still support sentencing reform. Passing a sentencing bill remains a top legislative priority for me as chairman, for Senator Durbin as well. We've been working since November to see what avenues we can have to move this bill along, particularly working with the executive branch of government. I'm confident about its prospects. The public supports action. I believe Republicans will find not only that the bill represents good policy, but that supporting it is also good politics. We've already seen this in some red states that enacted similar laws through their legislatures, where political support came from non-traditional constituencies. Obviously, the dynamic is different with a new president, and we have to take the different political landscapes into consideration to broaden support and build momentum for the bill. We're certainly willing to work with the administration to address outstanding concerns. And as in the past, we're willing to work with any outside organization that is serious about bargaining about the bill. But the liberal groups that support the bill, the civil rights groups, the religious organizations, the civil liberties organizations, also need to realize that President Obama is no longer president and that the new administration ran on a different platform. And law enforcement groups that so far have opposed the bill have raised items that they wish to include in the bill. They also must recognize that if they are to gain any of those provisions, they also need to bargain in good faith. We're open to hearing the changes that opponents in the bill in law enforcement want to see on either the front or back end, and to adopting provisions not previously in the bill. But let me emphasize, everyone must be willing to compromise, just as we senators have when negotiating the original bill that was introduced 2 years ago. Those who do not bring forward a good faith willingness to negotiate risk being left out and ought to be left out. I'm hopeful that we can maintain a balance that can expand support for the bill, with each side recognizing that, like the Senate's supporters of the compromise, no one gets everything that they want. Thank you again for welcoming me here today and for hosting this conversation and your promoting of this issue through the AEI. And those of you that are here that are interested in it, let me know what your views are, not just here today, but ongoing as negotiations continue. Thank you very much, and I'm ready for questions.
Thank you. First of all, let me thank you for your years of commitment to public service. You have a great level of wisdom and knowledge about DC and how it operates. One question that often comes to mind is, how did criminal justice reform become a bipartisan issue in ways that we have been unable to do with other issues of public policy?
Okay. I'd go back to 2014. I think I gave 2 speeches, or maybe 3, on the floor of the United States Senate, where I said that what Durbin and Lee wanted to do, doing away with mandatory sentencing, and I spoke about it in my remarks this morning, I could not go for. On the other hand, when you get a liberal like Durbin and a conservative like Lee, and you have a committee makeup like I have, I came to the conclusion that mandatory sentences could be done away with. And I thought that that was not right. So I thought I should take a leadership position and see what we could do to get a bipartisan agreement, move something along that would be fair, but still maintain a tough situation. And so that's why I didn't speak about it in my remarks. But a lot of people legitimately, and I'm not going to condemn people for finding fault with what Attorney General Sessions did when he spoke about going back to the pre-Obama or pre-Holder sentencing guide, or I should say prosecutorial discretion that he gave to his U.S. attorneys, that it was the wrong way to go. I could even say maybe I think it's the wrong way to go, but there doesn't have to be anything incompatible with what he's doing with what we're trying to do, because what we do is give people that have been sentenced unfairly, and they feel it, and their lawyers feel it, another bite at the apple by going before a judge to plead their case that their sentence ought to be shortened.
One of the things I hear, particularly as conservatives, is that when we try to talk about criminal justice reform, we're becoming soft on crime. How do you respond to that?
I think I just responded to it with what I said.
Good.
I have no apologies whatsoever to anybody that feels like we are being soft on crime, because you know what a lot of people think, and we haven't, I think we've challenged it, but not successfully. They think that if the Durbin-Grassley bill passes, that we're going to open up the prison gates and everybody's going to walk free. That's what the perception is. If we can correct that perception throughout the people that are opposed to the bill, they may know better, but we got to get them to say that what they know they ought to espouse, instead of thinking that we're going to open up the doors of the prisons. We're going to give people another bite at the apple to plead their case, and I don't see anything incompatible, and I don't see that being soft on crime.
Hear, hear. You mentioned the youthful faces in the audience, and we know that the millennial generation, more than likely, because of statistics, will find themselves more likely to be incarcerated than, let's say, people my age. And so what I want to do right now is actually to turn this over to members of the audience. We have 2 people with a microphone. We have 2 rules here at AEI. Number 1 is to give us your name and identify your affiliation. And number 2, ask a question, and please not give a speech. And so with that, who has a question for the senator? We have a question over here. The mic will come to you.
I might ask you to help me.
Oh, sure.
Here's the question.
Absolutely.
Good afternoon, Senator. My name is Aristotle Jones. I'm with the Friends Committee on National Legislation. My question for you is, what are your thoughts on the Second Chance Act? We know that returning citizens don't have a lifeline sometimes to come back and not recidivate back into prison or that lifestyle of crime due to the lack of safety net programs such as TANF and SNAP, that lifetime ban if someone has a drug felony conviction. So what are your thoughts on that?
What are your thoughts on the Second Chance Act?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I would see most of what the gentleman wants to accomplish when a person is released from prison. I would say most of that would come from the standpoint of doing more while people are behind bars, preparing them for life outside of crib. Now, whether that fits into the second chance or whether he's talking about programs behind, I do think that those programs where you get help in prison do need to be followed up, but I would say it's mostly guidance, helping people get jobs, helping people pre-prepared. But one of the main things that people should, if they want under the prison reform parts of our legislation, is better preparation, particularly for reading and communication. I think is one of the best things that we ought to be doing. But I think more needs to be done when they're behind bars than afterwards, and the afterwards would be follow-up. Now, I don't know whether the person that asked the question agrees with that or not, but if he disagrees, I'd be happy to listen to his point of view. I'd like to have you use the microphone if you would.
Just pass it. Thank you.
Yeah, but maybe I shouldn't.
Oh,
you're running the show here.
Oh, no, you're our guest.
Okay.
Go right ahead. Be
brief.
Okay.
I think I agree to an extent. When we look at the root causes of crime, when we look at it directly, we understand that it causes by extreme poverty, marginalization, and exclusion, and that cradles crime to be developed. And I believe that, you know, if you stop that at the source, and like you keep saying, you know, give people these resources in prison, but that kind of it kind of stuck right there, because some people can't even become a barber when they have a felony conviction. So what's the point of giving these programs if they come out of prison and they're in the same rabbit hole that they got in when they went in there? So I think from what my standpoint is, when you give people an opportunity to be a better person, you know, prison is the only thing that, you know, if we pay our student loan debt off, we're free. But if you go to prison, that's a stamp on you tattooed for life. But if you let people, you know, access SNAP or TANF or housing or Pell Grants, because we know education is linked to low recidivism, how can we do that?
Yeah, thank you. Good follow-up.
Yeah. Okay.
Particularly the part about the number of people who sit for what they call correction education programs. They sit for vocational programs, and yet they still can't come out and get a job because state law or otherwise may bar them because of their conviction, even though they have years of experience in something. So good points. We have a question on this side of the room.
Good morning. My name is Kara Gotch. I'm with the Sentencing Project. I want to thank Senator Grassley for his leadership on the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act. When I talk about this legislation, I often say it is a model of good policy and a model for all lawmakers to show how collaboration can be so effective when members across the aisle work together. So thank you so much for being the leader of that legislation. My question, I think, has somewhat to do with appropriations. I know the president's budget for BOP is, you know, is cutting BOP and cutting back on staff. But at the same time, they are anticipating an increase in the prison population after about 3 or 4 years of decline. And I want to know, you know, is this part of the conversations you're having with the administration around the need potentially to have sentencing reform if they're anticipating an increase, but at the same time are cutting staff? So, because the BOP is still overcrowded, and how are they going to address this overcrowding if they're not going to support sentencing reform?
There's 2 ways to answer your question. If we go ahead with, as we have for the last few years, with continuing resolutions or omnibus appropriation bills, about the only way that those of us that aren't on the Appropriations Committee where these decisions you're asking about are made, we contact members of the Appropriations Committee, but we're not at the table. And then when that bill gets out to the floor, generally a great big bill like that is not amendable. It may be amendable, but do you have time to amend it, and what do they allow, and all that sort of stuff. The other thing is, if we have the separate appropriation bills, as we should have, and Congress traditionally has until the last 8 or 10 years, then you get an opportunity when you got DOJ and like appropriation bills on the floor, you get a chance to offer amendments where we could deal, a person like me could deal specifically with that issue of X number of dollars more or less, you know. But now, with your question here for a non-appropriator, and I'm going to give you an answer not just about the program you're asking about, but almost any program. And of course, coming from a rural state, I get it asked about rural development and farm programs and stuff like that. I can only say, remember, a president proposes, a Congress disposes. We got the power of the purse, and both Republican and Democrat presidents over the last few years have advocated changes in programs, maybe eliminating, sometimes cutting, but they don't carry much weight. And I can't speak to any discussion that I've been involved with the Bureau of Prisons, but you can look at what went on when the Secretary of State was before when he was before the committee, and then also, let's say another example would be the EPA director before his committee. Most of the senators have been saying it's not realistic to do what the president wants to do. And I would imagine that if there's such a hearing involving your issue, you might hear the same thing from members of the Appropriations Committee.
So I'll take the last question right here.
Hi, my name is Olinda Moyd. I am the chief attorney at the Public Defender Service Parole Division. My question piggybacks off of the question that was asked regarding funding for the Bureau of Prisons. We know that the Bureau of Prisons has jurisdiction not only over federal prisoners, but also in DC. Our clients are sent to Bureau of Prisons facilities all over the country. Yesterday, I had the unfortunate opportunity to attend a graduation for gentlemen at the correctional treatment facility who had voluntarily signed up to participate in a 6-month drug treatment program. And on May 25th, we were notified that the funding for the program has been discontinued. And so the men who thought they were going to be in treatment for 6 months were told that the program will no longer exist. So we had the last graduation on yesterday. And so these it's not just the educational programs and job treatment programs, but also drug treatment programs that are being cut. And it really does put individuals in a terrible predicament when you then expect them to return to the community and be successful. So my question before the young lady asked was, are we going to see more cuts in funding for the Bureau of Prisons? And is someone at least thinking about the impact that it's going to have on individuals?
Thank you for both questions.
Yeah. Well, I don't know whether I can answer much differently than I did for the previous one, not being on the Appropriations Committee, but I do sense very definitely that the extent to which the president has gone in his budget suggesting reductions in programs just is not the real world. That's about the best I can say to you.
Well, Senator Grassley, again, thank you for your public service. Thank you for your candid conversation. Thank you for your leadership, and most importantly, thank you for your words.
Thank you.
Please stay seated while Senator Grassley exits the auditorium. And as he does this, we're going to change the set for the next part of our conversation. And so I'm going to go over to the podium and take care of that component. Before I begin, I want to thank both of you for the question about money, because we know that money matters, particularly as it relates to inside prison work. Drug rehabilitation and treatment is vitally important. And you mentioned the part about education inside. One of the projects we're working on here at AEI is a prison education and reentry initiative, where we've actually had a chance to visit 5 prisons, some of them which award an associate's degree, others offer a bachelor's degree. So it's something that's very important. Now that we've had an opportunity to hear from Senator Grassley and the work that he is undertaking in Congress, we're now going to have a conversation with 3 people who know a great deal about this subject of prison education and reentry professionally, and for a couple of people personally. The first person I'm going to introduce, and I'm going to introduce all three of them, and then they will come to the stage at one time. The first is John Huffington. He works for the Living Classrooms Foundation. He directs their workforce initiative in that city. He not only understands the importance of workforce for returning citizens, but he understands incarceration firsthand. He spent 32 years in prison, 10 years of those on death row. For a number of years, he tried to make his case about what happened with the crime, and in 2013, through a writ of actual innocence, he was released from prison. He's now involved with this work as it relates to recidivism and jobs, and he and I have had a chance to meet each other through a working group I have here at AEI. We also have Hain Yoon, who's the Director of Government Affairs at the Vera Institute here in Washington, D.C. She directs their initiatives to focus on national policy as it relates to criminal justice reform. She also has experience working on Capitol Hill. She worked for Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut, advising him on education issues as well as judiciary issues. We heard the senator mention Senator Durbin a number of times. She also worked for Senator Durbin, who's a Democrat from Illinois, on juvenile justice issues. Prior to coming to Washington, D.C., she spent 10 years in Los Angeles, my hometown, working on juvenile justice and issues, and also worked as a public defender. And so she's seen this firsthand. We'd also like to introduce Pat Nolan, who is Director of criminal justice reform at the American Conservative Union. He has played a number of roles in this area, including having worked with the American Political Action Committee, but also in having been the leader or being the leader of Right on Crime, which is a national movement of conservatives who want to talk openly and honestly about criminal justice reform. In addition to understanding the national conversation, he was also a member of the California State Legislature for 15 years. And during that time, he was also a Republican Assembly leader. Because of his work, he received an award from the Victim Advocate Award from Parents of Murdered Children. But he also was involved, or got involved in an FBI sting, which led to him pleading guilty of 1 count of racketeering. He spent nearly 24 months in prison and the rest of the time in a halfway program. Upon release, he committed himself to having an honest dialogue about criminal justice reform as someone who had been in public service but also had been on the other side of the Criminal Justice Reform Act or policies. And so with that, I'd like to invite all three of our speakers to take a seat on stage. What we will do is have a moderated discussion, and like I did with Senator Grassley at a latter point, we will open it up for a moderated Q&A. I'd like to let those know who are watching us by live stream that if you have any questions, our hashtag is Grassley at AEI. Again, hashtag Grassley at AEI. Feel free to send us a question. You never know, we may be able to answer that, ask that question. So with that, I'm going to start the moderated discussion at this point. So Pat, you've had a chance to listen to Senator Grassley. You guys have mutual friends and colleagues. What do you think about what he had to say?
Well, I think it's encouraging. He definitely was not a reformer and has come around. I think his bill is modest. As he said, nobody has everything they like. I say it's probably everybody has a little that they like. I think one of the basic problems is they haven't gotten at the heart of what's wrong with mandatory minimums. By having the safety valve, that's on the back end at the time of sentencing. But where mandatory minimums have the greatest impact, we've taken it out of the public square or the public courtroom, and it's all one-sided. It's in the prosecutor's office. And whatever they charge you with, if they decide to charge something with a large mandatory minimum, and now they often stack charges, you know, the same act can get you 6 different, depositing a check can be then wire fraud, can then be money laundering, can be, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. They stack these sentences so high that no one in their right mind challenges them. That's why 95% plead, because if you decide to fight them and say you're innocent, then they really throw the book at you. There's really a penalty for challenging the system. And the bills that are introduced don't address that. And we need to take that power unilaterally from the prosecutor and give it back to the judge. That's the real reform that will come in mandatory minimums. I admire the senator for trying to do what's possible to make progress, because there are some revanchists who, frankly, you know, their glory days were lock them up and throw away the key. But let me give you just a few facts that they misstate. Okay, the first thing is that only the bad guys go to prison. Okay, only the worst of the worst. Well, the fact of the matter is 50% of those who go to federal prison are in for drug crimes. And of those, 50% have the lowest level offense, a 1 or a 2. Many with no priors whatsoever, and most with no crime of violence. Only 14% of those in federal custody that were prosecuted by the feds over drug crimes, only 14% were major traffickers, were the kingpins. Okay? This is not Mr. Big. 86% are the little guys, the mules, the courier. And frankly, we're not stopping the flow of drugs because they're easily replaced on the street. Then he addressed tangentially the idea that we're going to open the doors and hordes of violent criminals are going to be released. I've testified for the Sentencing Committee several times, and the Association of U.S. Attorneys and the Fraternal Order of Police testify every time we try to reduce sentences that this is going to unleash a wave of violent criminals that are going to consume our center cities. Well, we have proof that that's not true inadvertently. The Sentencing Commission looked at those that had their sentence reduced by the crack powder reform, the Fair Sentencing Act, and they did 8.5 years, which is a long stretch, but they didn't do 10. Those that were let out early had a lower rate of recidivism than those who served the full 10 years. If it was going to be releasing them early would have unleashed this wild horde of violent people, then the recidivism would have been through the roof for them. Instead, it was less than those that did the whole term. And to my conservative friends, I say, look at it. You paid for another 1.5 years of prison for each of these folks and got 0 added public safety. So that's sort of my general comment on what Senator Grassley had. I'm glad he's doing it, but we need much stronger reform.
That was great use of data. I appreciate that, and putting it the conservative and Republican part of it in aspect. Hayne, you've seen this in many different ways, city level, now federal. What are your thoughts?
First of all, thanks so much for hosting this great discussion, Gerard, to you and the American Enterprise Institute. First, I just want to agree with everything that Pat said. I don't think I could have said it more eloquently than Pat. You know, I was a public defender, as you mentioned, in Los Angeles for 10 years in both the state system and the federal system. And I can say firsthand that working in the system, particularly in federal court, since we're talking about you know, federal prisons and people in federal prisons, that there are a lot of people who are caught up in these big drug trafficking cases that are not the top dog. They are not the kingpin of these cases. A lot of them are lower level offenders. A lot of them suffer from addiction. Prison isn't going to help them, and it's not going to make us any safer. I think that one of the most interesting things that Senator Grassley talked about was how, you know, back in the 1980s, 1990s, you know, there was this rush to incarcerate, to impose harsher penalties on people. And in subsequent years, he and other lawmakers have come to realize that that was a mistake, that was an overreaction. I work at the Vera Institute of Justice, and we believe that we have to properly identify the problem using data, evidence, actual statistics. And I think too much of our criminal justice policy has been driven by fear, by emotion, by exaggeration, and by myths of what the crime rate actually is. You know, right now we're living in a time of historically low crime rates, and I think, you know, that's been distorted by some folks. But the violent crime rate, the homicide rate, is actually at or near historic lows in most places across the country, with the exception of a handful of cities. We don't know exactly what's happening in those cities because, you know, we've had 1 or 2 years of data. Certainly something to watch, but I think it would be a rush to judgment to say that there's something happening there where we need a one-size-fits-all approach across the country. Yeah, and I'll stop there.
John, same thing.
Excuse me, I'm fighting a little bit of cold. So I guess I would look at it from a state perspective and maybe compare what Maryland just recently did. Last year they passed the Justice Reinvestment Act, and it was bipartisan, and it had the support of the executive, the judicial, and the legislative branch, and the House and the Senate. And it was good legislation, so I'm encouraged to see the attempt to get everybody to the table. Again, you know, I think I agree wholeheartedly with my colleagues' commentary about the lack of some of the teeth, what I would see as teeth in it. I do think they need to take it out of the prosecutor's hands. I think that trying to fix it on the tail end is counterproductive and expensive. You know, to the issue of what it would do as far as opening the door, again, I'll draw an analogy from Maryland. We had what was called the Unger case, and it dealt with, you know, the unconstitutionality of some jury instructions. So everybody prior to about 1980 had to be reviewed and resentenced. And our governor, a few years back, Governor Glendenning, had made this big speech about life means life. I'm not signing any paroles. And then we're one of 3 states where the governor has to actually sign a parole for lifer. So that had stymied any lifer's progress at that point. And I believe it was around 89. But the Unger case came along, and they couldn't really retry some of these 35, 40-year-old cases. So they ended up, you know, taking a very proactive approach in involving social workers and other folk to create home plans and support systems, and they released 181 lifers under Unger. And in Baltimore, I think our recidivism rate's around 48, 52%. Well, the recidivism rate for those Unger releases, 0. 0. So when we talk about is this going to open the gates, I think to what my colleague said earlier, no, and it's not going to increase the recidivism rate. I mean, nationwide, the recidivism rate is about 75% at the 5-year mark, I think. So I think we need to take these proactive approaches. But the senator made a very good comment too, and my friend Alinda made it as well. We have to fund the programs. We have to start inside. You know, you've heard my introduction. I served 32 years in the state prison system, and I got my college degree while I was there, and it was under a Pell Grant. And I was actually the last graduating class, 1995. And that was the year they took the Pell Grant. So I had to graduate as a junior. Luckily, I had enough credits, but it cost me my 2nd degree because I was approved for a dual degree. But you know, the one thing, well, there's 2 things that are proven reduction, or that are proven to reduce recidivism, and that's higher education and, you know, employment opportunities. And to take it out, and again, it was a knee-jerk reaction. It was a politician in Texas who stoked the fears of the public, who stoked the issue of, well, we have to pay for our children's education while our economy is getting a free education. And again, peeling back the layers of the onion, that wasn't based in reality. You know, prisoners nationwide were receiving less than 0.5% of the eligible money under Pell Grant. So what was the issue? You know, when it was proven to make a difference. You know, and I think we're here today because this crosses all party lines. It's not just a social issue anymore, a social justice issue. It's an economic issue. You know, Baltimore, we have, if you listen to our mayor, we have 10,000 returning citizens coming home every year. That's an economic issue. So it brings more people to the table. It furthers conversations. I'm very appreciative of Gerard and AEI for helping us to make it more of a national conversation, and that's what we need to do. There's a lot of factors. We have a lot more work to do. You know, my role is to work with the folk when they come home. But we need to I can't be silent. We need to be more proactive in dealing with expungement issues, We need to deal with the juvenile lifer issue. We need to get rid of solitary confinement. We just do. I mean, these are things that are going on in our prisons in our name, and we need to fix those things. As I've been reminded recently, we all have to be active in that and have a voice.
Prosecutors have come up a number of times in the conversation. I've got friends who are prosecutors. They've got a tough job and they're necessary. What do we tell them when they say, well, listen, the reason we end up receiving the kind of power is because, in fact, the judges weren't always doing the right thing. How do we know if we return it back that they will? Open for anyone.
Well, first of all, I'd say we know that giving the entire authority to the prosecutors hasn't worked. It's resulted in huge swaths of our inner cities being denuded of adult males. And those that return are ineligible to vote and find it extremely difficult to find a job. So that's part of the record. The second thing is, there are so many crimes now. We've criminalized so much activity and behavior that's morally neutral. Everybody agrees, rape, robbery, arson, burglary, those are crimes. And that's what we ought to be concentrating on. Instead, we're filing charges against the lobsterman that packs his lobsters in plastic rather than cardboard, not contrary to American law, but contrary to a Guatemalan regulation that the government of Guatemala said was invalid. Yet they did 8 years. Now, why did the American taxpayers pay for that? We have a SWAT team that raided Gibson guitars. Okay, I understand SWAT teams. Okay, if the suspects can flush drugs down the toilet, you want to stop that. But they can't flush guitar fretboards down the toilet. And who knew the Department of Interior had SWAT teams? Bulletproof vests, automatic weapons, helmets. My goodness, we have militarized police, and this is, of course, done. They're doing this because the prosecutors asked for it. Why on earth? Especially when the Gibson executives have said, "Tell us what you need, we'll give it to you." Instead, they have this big raid. So prosecutors are. Now, this is a broad stroke, and that's not true. There's some fine prosecutors. I know many that are really good people. But there are others that are Inspector Joverts, and they'll hound people, and that's not justice. And they shouldn't be able to do that on their own. There ought to be somebody above them in a public setting that can review what they do.
Okay.
And I would just add to that, I think there are a lot of prosecutors go into the business, because they're well-meaning individuals. They want to do good, but I think part of the problem is we have this very adversarial system where it comes about, getting wins and getting the longest sentence possible. The other, I think, issue is that prosecutors themselves don't often have the data to know what works and what doesn't. They have a very limited toolbox. And so, if you have the limited set of options and your fear is that someone is going to go out and commit another crime, I think usually prison or jail seems like the easiest option. And we need to do more to give them different options, for one thing, but we also need to be able to provide more data about what works and what doesn't, and then hold them accountable, as Pat is saying.
Okay. John?
I'm smiling because I have lawyers in the room and they're all looking at me right now like, don't do it, don't do it. I have an active case, so I guess I'm going to bite my tongue.
Okay.
About prosecutors, but yeah, I agree. These are folk that have immunity and they don't answer to anybody, and there needs to be checks and balances in everything. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
And to show the difference in my lifetime, Ed Meese, who I have known for years, is a wonderful man, and before he got involved in politics, he was a line prosecutor in Santa Clara County. And he told me that one of his greatest joys was, after an investigation, saying to the subject of it, "You're clean. We're not going to do anything." Now, attorneys tell me, no, when they have, quote, commitment to a case, when they've spent time on it, they're going to find something. And an IRS agent said to a state senator in California, Senator, we can carve our paddle to fit anybody's ass. You know, and that's frightening, because Beria, who was Stalin's head of the secret police, said something similar. He said, you bring me the man, I'll find the crime. So it used to be, we discovered a crime and searched for who did it. Now we decide who the target is and search for a crime that they did. And that's very, very different. Last thing, the joke when I was in law school is that a prosecutor could get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. Well, the new joke among prosecutors, and this is absolutely true, prosecutors I know have said this, any run-of-the-mill prosecutor can convict a guilty man. It takes a truly great one to convict an innocent man. And that gets to the, I'm going to win, you know. And that is a frightening, frightening thought for any of us, no matter what age you are, color, economic status. That is a threat to every one of our liberties. And the founding fathers would be howling at that.
The point you mentioned about shaping the paddle for someone's bottom reminded me, from a social science perspective, is something called problem definition. That you already have the solution. You're just creating the problem for it. One of the things I hear from people on both sides of the fence, we're spending a lot of time on trying to reform the system for some people who were, let's say, incorrectly sentenced. But we've got people who actually deserve to be there. What do we say to the families who have lost a loved one? To them, because they're like, who's talking for us? Where's the reform for us? What do we say? We'll start with Hayne and we'll work our way over.
I mean, I guess my response would be, it would be, I think, a mistake to say that victims of crime all fit into one category and have one set of responses. I think you will see in talking to different groups that different folks have very different perspectives. You know, we have an office at Vera called Common Justice that, you know, that talks about, you know, victims working directly, you know, for a holistic approach to resolve the issues that they deal with. You know, a lot of them suffer from trauma and things like that after a crime, but sending someone away to prison where they're not getting help and may actually come out even more dangerous than when they went in, not only doesn't help them, but it's not going to help everybody else, and it will actually make all of the rest of us less safe. And so I think certainly you do hear a lot of people advocating for harsher sentences who have been victims of crimes themselves or have family members, and I think a lot of that, you know, drove the 3 strikes law in California. A lot of us lived through that in California. So certainly I think there is some tendency for retribution, also incapacitation, and, you know, I think we need to sort of understand what those motivations are. And, you know, from my perspective, you know, there might be some serious violent offenders that, you know, can't be treated any other way than prison, but the question for those people also is, well, how are we treating them when they get to prison? Are we going to make them worse by locking them in solitary confinement, by not giving them access to programs, by not having any kind of reentry services for them? Or are we going to make sure that they're getting everything they need in prison so that they're not going to get out and keep committing crimes or worse crimes than before they went in?
Yeah, I really have a tender heart for victims. That's really, you know, how I cut my teeth on crime issues in the legislature, working with victims of crime. And what you know, what I said, you know, the basic crimes that frankly we don't need statutes to tell us wrong. We know murder is wrong. You know, when Cain killed Abel, there was no statute, but it was wrong. You know, there are certain crimes that people are afraid of, that have trouble sleeping at night. That's what prisons are for, to segregate those folks from society. The problem is the police and the prosecutors have to make sure it's the right person that did it. And hiding evidence and suborning perjury and paying off jailhouse snitches to get them to testify is a perversion of the system. That's not going to help the victim to lock up the wrong guy. That means the perpetrator's still out there. But I do feel prisons have a legitimate, and that's where I depart company with some on the left that are abolitionists. I'm not. I think prisons prove a very useful function. But then, as you said, how do they come out? What kind of neighbors will they be? If we treat them like dirt, if we tell them thousands of times, you ain't got nothing coming, and it's said with the meaning that you're worthless. You come from nothing, you are nothing, you will be nothing. As they walk out the gate, if we say, the guards say, see you in a month, how does that make them feel when they're trying to go straight? How have they been equipped? How do they deal with anger? How do they be a good spouse, a good parent? All those things are essential. Have we dealt with the drug addiction? It's a myth. We lock up these drug users, and only 10% of the federal prisoners get drug treatment. Well, that's a fraud on the public. To lock them up for 10 years and do nothing about the underlying addiction and release them on the street, they're still addicts. Who are we kidding? And the idea that somehow, well, at least they'll dry out in prison. Wrong. There were more drugs available in prison than there was on my college campus. And it didn't all come into the visiting room either. A lot of lunch pails brought it in. So anyway.
He's a graduate of USC, so no bad words on USC for the record. John, you want to?
Yeah, I think I agree with what Pat just said. I think the important thing first is that we have a transparent truth, and that has to start with the prosecutor's office. You can't build a false case and give victims false information and false, theology to that. I'm very sensitive to this issue, and I think that victims themselves don't appreciate when somebody else speaks for them. So I'm cognizant of that. With that being said, I think that there's a stanza. I was in the JC's, Junior Chamber of Commerce, and there's a stanza in our motto or our creed that says government should be of laws rather than of men. So taking that thought, we're a nation of law, and here in Maryland at least we have victim impact, and they come in at the sentencing phase and have an opportunity to present. And because we don't have mandatory sentencing at the state level, the judge can take that into consideration. But the end result, because Maryland's abolished the death penalty now, the end result is it's time. Now there is a life without parole sentence in Maryland, but if we're not talking about that, like Pat said, we're talking about incarcerating somebody for a period of time with an end goal of what? Preparing that person to successfully and healthy have a reentry into society. So I think that that's part of the conversation we're here to have today is what does reentry look like? At what point do we say enough is enough? Do we take the scarlet letter off and allow somebody to reintegrate successfully, to allow them to get housing, to get employment, instead of saying you'll never amount to anything, good luck, we'll see you in a couple of months. Because if I see you in a couple of months coming back into prison, what damage did you do that brought you back? How many more lives did you affect? That's so non-productive, and we as a thinking, comprehensive society need to say, we don't want to do that because our friends, our family are going to be a victim. If you look at the flyer for today, and every time we do these, we always start out with that same phrase, 2.2 million adults are incarcerated. Do we comprehend what 2.2 million people is like? And that's just in the system. We have, in the United States, the amount of people with criminal records outnumber the entire population of France. I just read that in an article. I mean, we need to start putting this in perspective. It used to be, a city problem, and we didn't have connection. But I guarantee you, if we polled the audience right now, how many people know somebody that's been impacted, victim or otherwise, by the criminal justice system? It's such a smaller world now, and it does impact all of us, and that's why we're here today to have that conversation.
The point that he just mentioned about the number of people, particularly those who also have had some time with in jail or a interaction with the jail system, when you add that with state prison and federal prison, you're looking at nearly 7 million people. we've heard a great deal about what's happening, and we've heard guys mentioned a number of times. We know that since 1980 moving forward, there's been about a 400% increase on the number of women who are incarcerated. For the women who are incarcerated, a lot of them are often the single adult in the household, often the sole economic provider, and some, the young man's question earlier about SNAP, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, that's going to have an impact. And we know that 5 million children wake up every morning not to hear good morning from a parent because he or she's incarcerated. So from the recidivism side of the fence, that's one part. What's the aspect about women in prisons? What are we doing for them once they're inside? And on the recidivism side, how does that impact families? Starting with women, but we can talk with men as well. Start with Pat.
Yeah, they are a forgotten part of the prison population. I'll give you 2 examples. The camp I was at was being changed to a women's camp because the court ordered it. Here we had all these women prisoners in the federal system, but no camp in California so they could be close to their children. The judge ordered them, so they were turning our camp into a women's camp. They were taking the visiting room and cutting it in half to make a medical section. And I said, this is crazy. We don't have enough room for us for visiting. If they have women in the camp, boy, they're going to have a lot of visitors. They said, you're wrong. Women don't get visits in prison. And I looked into it, and they don't. They're abandoned. The adults in the young, most of them are young ladies' families, told them, stay away from that guy. He's bad news. He's the bad crowd. So when they get in trouble, they say, see, I told you so. You shouldn't have been hanging out with him. And they cut him off, whereas their heart bleeds for their boys. And, I can't explain it, but so they're abandoned by their family. The second thing is, the system has not adjusted to their women. It was built for men, but they've now added a substantial number of women. And for instance, in 30-some states, they still shackle and manacle women during childbirth. Now that's barbaric. How on earth could we treat another human being that way? And this is when they've got an armed officer in the room with them. Why on earth would they torture them by making them manacled and shackled? Well, the corrections people all tell you, well, inmates have been known to fake an illness and escape when they get to the hospital. Okay, how many women can fake pregnancy? Okay. If they can, you'd better get a new physician's assistant in there. Okay. The second thing is, what woman can get off the gurney during labor and skip? I mean, this is absurd, and yet it's cruel. And the corrections officials just say, well, we're being neutral. It's abysmal. And they're deprived of their children, and no matter what they've done wrong, God arranged this so that mothers would care for children. They need that nurturing. In some cases, when the baby is born to a prisoner, they're taken from the mother without even letting her hold them. Now, psychologists will tell you it's those moments when they can feel their mother's breath, where they can smell their mother. This is the womb that has nurtured them all those months. It's a stabilizing thing to relate to them now in this cold, cruel world they've come into, that steady presence of their mom is there. And yet some systems deprive the mother of that. One last thing. Sure. There are some wardens who've limited women to 1 tampon a day. Now, what idiot would do that? Well, they said they were flushing down the toilet. Well, deal with that some other way. But, anyway, that's how bad women are treated.
When you mentioned the part about holding the baby and the breath and what it means for the child, my AEI colleague here, Catherine Stevens, yesterday had an entire event on early childhood learning, brain science, and what the physical and emotional connection. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Well, so thanks so much for raising this issue. I mean, I think it's a really big issue right now, and it hasn't really gotten a whole lot of attention. But as you mentioned, the number of women incarcerated has skyrocketed. And I think in large part, this is because of the over-criminalization Pat talked about before of minor offenses. At Vera, we've been looking at jail data since 1970, and I think one of the starkest patterns that's emerged is this rise of women in jails because they are much more likely than men to be convicted of nonviolent offenses. So it's not as if women are going around committing more violent offenses than they used to. They are largely in jail for nonviolent offenses. So why are we arresting them and housing them in jail, especially when many of them are single mothers, solely responsible for their children, and it leads to the breakup of the family and potentially has harmful effects on their children down the line. What's also really disturbing is that we found that a huge percentage of these women who are incarcerated are victims of sexual abuse and assault. And so these women, first of all, have been victimized before they enter the system, but then they're also much more likely than men to be victimized in the system, incarcerated with prison rape, sexual assault, etc. So prison is often the worst place to house, or jail, to house these women, and we need to do a lot more to keep them out of the system at the front end. But also a lot of facilities were really set up for men in mind. Pat talked about sort of the feminine hygiene issues, but family visitation. There are much fewer facilities for women in general at the federal and the state level, so women will end up being housed farther away from their families. We know that for both men and women, family engagement, if you are going to be incarcerated, is really important. It's important for you to be reintegrated back to your family, to have those family bonds, the social support that you need. Also, when you get out and families become reunited, it's important to have maintained contact while in the inside. And I'll just add in terms of jails also, because you were talking about the rise of women in jails, we're also seeing a huge rise nationally in the use of jails at all. I think prisons have gotten a lot of attention, but we're seeing 11 million annual admissions now in our jail system, and this is a huge increase from the 1970s, and we need to look at why this is happening locally, because jails are a local issue, but there are certainly some trends that have emerged, one of which is that some of the biggest increases in jail use have been in rural areas, not big cities, as I think most people tend to believe, but places like New York City, Los Angeles, other big cities, the trend lines are actually going down, whereas in rural areas, the jail rates have been skyrocketing, and I think too often women are being caught up in these policies.
Yeah. In Maryland, well, the prison I got released from in Maryland was Patuxent, and it's a co-ed prison. I think it's the only one in the country. Now, they don't intermingle, but there's a building that houses the females, and I worked in the MC plant, the sign plant that was there, and we had the men's side and we had the women's side. So as a clerk, I had to interact with both sides for payroll reasons and everything else. So I got to know a lot of them, but we also got to observe them. And to that point about the visitation, they actually don't get a lot of visits. Our day room, we could actually look out and the visitors have to come across the compound, ours and theirs. And it was so rare to see somebody, they would come straight for the men's and you'd have to veer to the right to walk to the women's. And it was so rare to see a visitor going down there. And they would do a lawn visit, which was like a family day visit, and the women would come out and they'd be given this end of the yard, like you stay down here and the rest of us could stay up here, and they would come out in groups. So it'd be like maybe 6 or 7 of them, and be like one group that came in, like one person's family, and they all shared that family experience. So it's a shame, and I don't know the social reasons for it, but I think that women are more nurturing and supportive, so they're more willing to support a man that's locked up as compared to, I gotta speak for our gender, we're not. We're not gonna come in and visit a woman in prison. We don't have that same nurturing spirit, I suppose. And that's a shame because you need a support system throughout the incarceration. The programs are very limited for anybody, let alone the women. There's very few prisons, and then there's limited resources of staff that they'll apply to that. On the reentry end, it's even worse. I have, living classrooms, we have women in our program, but because we're a rapid attachment to work and it's very basic sanitation, landscaping kind of work, not a lot of women are attracted to that. So we do other training components for them as well, administrative assistance, and try to find pathways, career pathways. But there's a dearth of resources for them. I didn't mean to be disrespectful. I pulled my phone out because I actually just read an article, and I wanted to make sure I was saying the state right, where when we're talking about the kids, Pennsylvania is just now enacting what they call a game changer legislation, which is going to provide a trust fund for the children of incarcerated parents. So too often we forget about the children when, as Gerard points out, when they're parentless and they're being exposed to a prison system, they can easily fall into this hamster wheel cycle as well. So putting that support system in at an early age is really important. And I hadn't fully read the article. I actually just sent it to somebody who's working with children of incarcerated parents. And I just want to make sure I was quoting the state right. So it's Pennsylvania, so anybody wants to look at that.
I hear a great deal about this issue, and I think about poverty and what it means for families. And we've, Bob Dorr, one of our scholars here, works a great deal on that. And we've talked about data, and while that's important, and one of my AEI colleagues, Nat Malkus, is also in the room. And so those are two people I look to for this subject in general and how it relates to education. We're now going to turn it over to the audience again. As we said before, we've got questions. All right, so I'm going to start back here, and we've got about 20 minutes, and so if we can ask a question, I can get as many people as possible.
Thank you. Douglas Wood from the Ford Foundation. It's a pleasure to be here with my colleague Hillary Pennington. Just a quick question and a quick comment. So many of us know about the Second Chance Pell work. There were over 200 colleges and universities who applied, representing 48 states, blue, red, green, purple. So the question is, how do we build upon the momentum that is out there? And how do we think about linking it to other aspects of criminal justice reform? And then the comment I'd like to make is I visited my 73rd prison about 6 weeks ago out in California at the California Institute of Women. And we're part of a large program called Renewing Communities. We're working with the state, working with 13 other foundations. We're now we're in 32 of California's 35 prisons, nearly 100 community-based organizations involved in that work for reentry. So I'm glad to hear that the College and Prison and Reentry is together. But there was a woman who actually petitioned the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation to leave Chowchilla to come to the California Institute of Women because there were no educational programs at Chowchilla. And she was one among 600 women at Chowchilla on a waiting list to have educational opportunities. Now, thankfully, we'll be able to move into Chowchilla in the fall, but that just gives you a sense of the interest, particularly among people in prison, and also highlights the challenges that women face in prison, because we know that if we go to these programs, they often have to take these courses during their recreational hour as opposed to what happens in men's prison. So just want to hear about the momentum piece and then your comments about the challenges of educational issues with women in prison.
For those of you in the present audience and viewing audience, really quick, Second Chance has come up a couple of times. In 1994, the federal crime bill removed the use of Pell Grants for prisoners. As John mentioned, he was able to receive his. There's one estimate to say that there are approximately 300 in-prison programs, and that actually reduced itself to less than 20. And so a few years ago, President Obama, the Department of Education, supported a program to do so. There's 69 programs in the country that are now doing this, and just want to put that in perspective. Start with you, John, and then we'll move to you.
Well, like I said, I'm a product of it, so I'm one of the biggest fans for it. And we do have it here in Maryland. University of Baltimore received the Pell Grants and went into MCIJ. Goucher was already in there. You know, when they took the Pell Grants out, it was George Soros and the OSI. It put some money into keeping some college education pieces going. So I think that, you know, you have to take, I guess it can be hard to quantify, because now you're limiting to folk that are maybe within 5 years of release. You're trying to be able to build up your statistical database of how effective it can be. But I think you also need to include the returning citizens that are already out here with college degrees and look at what they're doing and what the benefit was and apply it sort of reverse engineered back. So that, you know, in order to keep the momentum, we can't do it off of what's going on right now. Okay. Come talk to me. I've got 2 caseworkers right now, they're 3. They're returning citizens, and they got their college degrees while they were inside. You know, look at the success models of those that came before and apply it retroactively, because it's needed, and it's a smart investor. So.
Anything, Hayden?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Doug, you and the Ford Foundation have been real leaders in post-secondary education prisons, as has Gerard, and thanks so much for being a champion for this program in particular. I really think we need more folks like Gerard and John, who is probably a perfect ambassador for this kind of program. I think part of the challenge is just public education. I don't think a lot of people realize that people in prison were eligible for Pell until 1994, as Gerard mentioned. And I don't think people really understand the value of these programs. I think people see it as, oh, it's sort of this extra benefit for people who don't deserve it, when it actually is the opposite. I think it's a really critical component to both, prison safety, because these programs actually reduce violence in facilities themselves, because it's giving folks a productive thing to do, but it also makes them much more likely to get employment after release, really lowers recidivism rates, I think, by something like 43%. And it's a really great investment for taxpayers if you're comparing it to the rate of return for incarceration. And I think, we all need to do more, I think, to get the message out, to use folks like Gerard and John, as I said, and to have people who've actually been through the experience can talk about what it meant to them, to their families, to their communities, to be able to get that education and bring it to the outside.
I want to make sure I'm not missing people from the podium. We'll go right here.
Hi, my name is Sophie. I'm a student at Berkeley, and I wanted to ask about what your thoughts are on reform priorities to reduce racial disparities in incarceration and victimization of crime.
Thank you.
I think that's a great question. It's also, I think, a very tough question to answer, honestly. As a public defender, I think one of the things that you see day in and day out is this huge and very stark racial disparity, and it's in your face. You can't ignore it. And I think a lot of folks are struggling with, even in some of the jurisdictions that have implemented reforms, sometimes it's reduced racial disparities, and sometimes it hasn't. And I don't know that we have sort of a perfect formula, but it's really critical that we keep trying. And I think, in fact, some jurisdictions have implemented some reforms, but not seen the racial disparity go away. And I think we're struggling to understand why that's happening. I mean, I think certainly there's a certain amount of unconscious racism in the system. I talked earlier on about just fear in general driving criminal justice policy, and I think that certainly has a lot to do with it. There's still, we still have a lot of suspicion of each other and communities that we're not familiar with, and I think that leads to particularly in state court, where there is so much discretion for both judges and prosecutors. The flip side of that is that if you're sentencing someone who seems very unfamiliar, who seems like someone who's more suspicious, you might give them a harsher sentence. And I saw it daily. I might have a white client or an Asian American client for one charge, and an African American client for the exact same charge. And the white or Asian defendant might actually have had a more serious history, but yet they would get a lighter sentence from the judge. And I don't think that these judges were consciously imposing a harsher sentence. So I think we need to look at why is this happening, to really interrogate that. And I think we need to gather more data consistently. And I think a lot of judges probably don't realize maybe the disparities that they're seeing, and develop more mechanisms to hold people more accountable, both prosecutors and judges.
Hayden earlier mentioned the importance of data. She has a law degree, but she also has a degree in sociology from one of the best institutions in the country on that subject, University of Chicago. And so making sure you bring that kind of information is important. We get someone from the table here. Gentlemen, yes. And then I'll move to the middle.
My name's Riley. I'm with the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. So towards the end of the Obama administration, there was a push to phase private prisons out of the federal prison system, and then Attorney General Sessions in the Trump administration, he got rid of that memo, and now they're going to go away from that and keep private prisons in the system. I think most people agree that private systems are much, much, much less effective than public prisons. But what can we do to reform private prisons now that they're kind of in our system for at least the next 4 to 8 years, and make them more effective without just completely getting rid of them, because that's probably unrealistic.
Anyone can take that one.
Well, I'm a dissenter here. It doesn't matter who writes the checks, it's how they treat the inmates and what programs they provide. I haven't seen evidence that privates are any less effective or more effective than government prisons, but the government has a special interest too. I've said to understand how a prison works, take a DMV office, string barbed wire around it, give the clerks guns. I went into prison thinking these were the good guys, they were there to protect us. Nope, they're union guys. The work hours, and also it's a myth that there's a prison system. It's a series of duchies, and every warden is a duke. You can get a good warden, and it's terrific. They have programs, they have volunteers, the COs treat the inmates with respect, and there are no hassles. You get a bad warden, and it's hell. A lot of people sent to the SHU, a lot of brutalization of inmates, a lot of inmate-on-inmate violence, very few programs. And it just goes institution by institution. So I think privates are getting a bad rap. Hold them to the contract. You know, one of the interesting things I would do with the privates, there's a contract, hold them to a certain recidivism rate. They only get paid if a certain percentage of the people don't recidivate. That ought to be for publics too, I'd say. You know, the proof is in the pudding. Their job is not to warehouse, it's to prepare the 95% of the inmates that are going to be released to be good neighbors. Anyway, I just think we spend too much time arguing about private or public, and again, I don't care who signs their check, it's how they treat the inmates and whether the inmates are prepared.
I'm sorry, I'm just going to disagree slightly with Pat in that, I'm not an expert in private prisons, but I do think there's a lack of oversight in general for state and federal prisons, but I think it's even more of a problem for private prisons. And if you don't have oversight, you end up with the kinds of abuses that Pat mentioned, and all kinds of other poor treatment of people who are incarcerated. And I think the issue historically with private prisons has been that they're even less transparent, that they have, sort of fewer reporting requirements, less oversight and control, by the state and federal authorities. And so, in terms of your committee, I would urge you to really have robust oversight of these facilities if they are going to exist.
And I want to jump in on it too, because I totally disagree with the concept of private prisons. And it goes back to what I said earlier, the government should build laws rather than men. So we as a country, we feel the need to have a penitentiary, and it was created for penance. That's the concept behind a penitentiary. So to put that out to private industry, that's human chattel. There's no other description to put on that. You're dealing in humans. And I mean, they trade on the stocks exchange. So the motivation is your bottom line, it's your profit margins, and the reports that I've seen, unfair or not, are not favorable for the way that they treat their inmates. I mean, DC shut down their prison system, and they farmed out. So there have not been good results and good returns on any investment of that. So I can't agree with it doesn't matter who runs it. I think if we're going to have prisons, then the government own that. You're the one that wants to do it, own it. And then be responsible and be very transparent.
Two things. The penitentiary was a noble experiment that failed. The people went crazy in there, literally. That's why we changed them to departments of corrections, because the penitentiary didn't work. The second thing is, I just, last week there was an article about 3 federal officers in the Metropolitan Detention Center that had repeatedly raped women. Not once or twice, repeatedly, for months. And I would stack the record of any public. Look at, I hope the Oversight Committee looks at the prison rape statistics of the privates and the publics. it's horrendous in public facilities. Staff on inmate, inmate on inmate. It's also bad in some of the privates, but some are good. So judge them institution by institution, hold them accountable, but the fact, you know, saying the profit motive, you know, every CO there has a profit motive, you know, and they'll tell you, oh, I've only got another 3 years on my sentence. They're counting the days to retirement. They're, you know, they're bureaucrats with badges and guns. So, you know, again, hold them to standards too. But anyway, we disagree.
No, healthy disagreement. It's good. Yes.
Yes, good morning. My name is Stephen Alm. I'm a former state judge in Hawaii, and before that I was a local prosecutor and the United States Attorney under President Clinton. I want to thank AEI for doing this because realistically, leadership in criminal justice is going to come from Republicans because they're known as being more likely, they're known as being tough on crime, so they can be flexible and smart about it. And I'm glad Senator Grassley recognized the fact that even though we're in DC, almost 90% of the inmates across the country are in the state systems. And that's where most of the innovation is going on. My question is, given the fact that the AG Sessions does have a big bully pulpit, and that can have an effect, what does the panel think about encouraging the states to keep up with this innovation, to keep up with reducing recidivism, being smart on crime, and what are the likelihood of success for that?
It's worth noting that Judge Alm spent time as a judge in Hawaii and was responsible for creating what we know as the HOPE program. He worked with a number of judges across the country, so want to make sure that you know that, not only as young people, but those in the audience. Turn it over to you. Anyone?
Well, let me talk a little about the HOPE. They were analyzed by UCLA and Pepperdine, and it's a phenomenal concept that now I think 17 states have adopted. 32, okay, I'm way behind. But they essentially tell the inmate to take responsibility for their life. Judge Alm would call them in and say, look, we take these rules seriously. Mm-hmm. You live by them, you're going to do fine. You break them, you're going to be in trouble. And they'd have random drug tests. If they had a dirty, they were hauled into his court that day and put in jail. But not for 6 years, for 48 hours. They could sit and think about it and then come back before him. He says, look, you want to get straight or you want to be a knucklehead? It's up to you. And what they found was, and I'm a little stale on these statistics, but my recollection is they had 68% fewer missed probation appointments, 66% fewer dirty drug tests, and I think 50-some% lower crime than the comparison population. Now that's good for the public, it's public safety. It's good for the inmates because it gives them a chance not to get that long prison ticket, and it's good for the taxpayers. So, and Judge Alm did it on his own with his own budget against the opposition of a lot of folks there. It's just been wonderful what he does. As far as the Sessions memo, I'm troubled by it, but I've been in backdoor communications with some folks that I think there's going to be some more encouraging signs come out. Certainly the states are where the action is. That's where we put most of our effort. We are involved in the federal level because that's where the press pays attention. But the actual lives that are affected are the state level. And we've had, I think 30-some states work with us for some sort of prison reinvestment. So that's where the action is.
Yeah, I agree. And I think everyone who works in the criminal justice field would agree that states have really led the way on reform and will continue to, regardless of what the federal government does. And our research shows that 20 states over the last 15 years cut both their incarceration rates and their crime rates. So those two are obviously, can work hand in hand.
Yeah, I agree. I said earlier, I think we have a very progressive, and it's a Republican administration here in Maryland, but very accessible, very in tune to the criminal justice system and to our efforts with reentry, from Kelly Schultz, Secretary of Labor, to Secretary Moyer, who heads the DPSCS, and Glenn Funstein, who's the exec director of GOCAP. Gerard and I are part of a proposal right now that we put in, modeled off of PEP in Texas. So, here in Maryland. It's an entrepreneurship leadership training program that we want to put behind the fence. It was very well received, and we're just waiting on some funding issues to launch that here with the University of Baltimore. So we're excited at the opportunities that Maryland has been presenting, and I think that the more successes we have, the more it does push the national conversation.
All great things must come to an end. I do see there are more hands, particularly I was going to call on the people at the table here, which I can't do now, but I'm noticing you to at least say, we'll give you first dibs to come up here and ask your question. This is just part one of many conversations that we must have. And I want to thank all of our panelists as well as the Senator for the conversation today. What I leave with all of you are two things. Number one, we've got to think deeply and differently about what criminal justice reform looks like. It's not the left or the right. The question is, do we leave people behind or do we do the right thing? We'll figure that out. Number two, people in here are impacted by crime in multiple ways. Most of us in here, if we say to raise your hand or you know someone, a number of hands would go up. But here at AEI, we offer an opportunity for dialogue. I'm glad all of you who are here in person and those of you who are watching live stream are part of the dialogue. Let's continue and let's give our panelists a round of applause. If you have questions, just come to the front. Let the people at this table have first dibs or questions. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.